Hola, homies and goats. Old Goat here. I want to talk to you this morning about leadership. Did a video the other day about the Cartesian plane of organizations and really us as individuals and how our being, our belief system, in other words, or an expression of our being anyway, comes out in our belief system, and then our behavior, our practice. So the way I put it on the board was doctrine and practice, teaching, what we espouse, what we purvey to other people, but how that really determines the quality of our life, but also our associations, the tribes that we're consider ourselves to be a member of, the people that we associate with, the groups we associate with. Today I want to talk about leadership and the validity or lack thereof of leadership. How do you assess whether or not somebody really has moral qualification? Now, if somebody's duly elected to office, I think you need to comply with them. I've known some bad cops, but when I get pulled over, I do my best to comply. I may not be able hide my frustration if they pulled me over unjustly, and that has happened. And, I get it. I was involved in law enforcement for a very short period of time. And so, there's two sides of that coin. Their world isn't always easy, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you're in that world. But influence is really the essence of what leadership is about. Have you ever thought about that? We tend to think of the characteristics of leadership as intelligence, sometimes depending on the realm you're in, physical fitness, dexterity, strength, charm, charisma. All these things play into our expectations of leadership. But really, leadership boils down to just simply, do you have influence with other people? And if you do, then you're a leader. And the fact is, almost all of us, probably all of us, unless we're just living in complete isolation, we have impact, we have influence on some circle of acquaintance and connection and relationship. And so this is, again, a question we need to ask ourselves. What is the basis of our relationship? I will freely acknowledge that there were times when, as a parent, the way that I exercised my influence was by simply exercising my authority. And as a parent, you have some authority and you have a responsibility to do something with that authority. So I'm going to borrow today from a guy named, and I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing this right, but I think his name is Bila Banathe. He wrote a leadership program for the Boy Scouts of America. And I was a Boy Scout for a period of time in my youth, in my preteens and early teen years. And that was a pretty good experience for me. And he said that leadership rests on three pillars, but there are also three things that can test us. And I don't remember him presenting it this way, but it's the way I tend to look at leadership now. I ask if they're fulfilling these three things. And if they're not, then I'm very cautious and careful about whether or not I commit to following them or what I commit of my resources to them. And again, I'm not talking about being civilly disobedient or unlawful. I'm just simply talking about in those personal associations when somebody says, follow me, I'm going to ask these three questions. The first one is, and obviously, do they have authority? Do they really have a right to say, hey, I want you to follow me? There are a lot of people who their only authority for leadership is their own need for power, their own thirst to control and manipulate other people. That's the way they get their jollies in life. That's where they get their dopamine hit. In terms of narcissism, they talk about narcissistic supply. Some people move into leadership for no other reason than that they get their own personal ego needs met. Not a valid leader. Now, again, so many of our leaders, whether they're corporate, sports world, governmental, they're just, and unfortunately in also benevolent organizations, which would include churches, a lot of times those guys are there and they have a right to be there as far as they've been vetted to a certain extent and they can accomplish some things, but that doesn't negate the fact that their personal agenda is just self-aggrandizement. I want to stay as far away from that kind of leader as I possibly can. I may need to comply with their demands, but I don't have to invest my heart in following them, and I don't have to invest in them as a person to acknowledge that they have a level of validity, but their real moral authority is lacking. That's the question. Do they really have moral authority to run my life? Maybe to tell me what to do, but not to run my life. Secondly is accountability. Real leadership, and this is what validates authority, is when somebody's accountable. And unfortunately, we have accepted a model, especially in the religious world, where, well, if there's accountability, well, we've got a board of deacons, or we've got a church board, or we've got accountability among the pastor, the eldership of the church. If the head is not, and I'm talking about the human head, if the human head is not accountable to the feet in the church, in other words, to every member of the body, they're not accountable. It's amazing how often somebody messes up in leadership. And again, this isn't just related to churches, of course, but they mess up in leadership, and they think that if they really get caught and cornered, if they acknowledge their mistake and say they're sorry, oh, we got to pretend like it never happened. That is not accountability. Accountability, and when a politician or a celebrity figure says, I take full responsibility for my actions, but there aren't going to be consequences, that is not accountability. Accountability is when you clean up what you messed up. Did a video, I entitled it Mess Up, Fess Up. Not very popular, apparently. Not very many views. But what we need to understand is that is the very formula for any hope that we might have of restoration, of really becoming a better leader. Now, the interesting thing is sometimes when you mess up and you fess up, the sphere of your influence actually shrinks as far as numbers, but the impact of your influence tends to expand. You know, I think of people I know who have been involved with 12-step programs and the impact they have had, and they didn't get that impact because they became addicted or hurt or hung up about something and they entered a 12-step program. They have become more powerful in their impact because they are much more transparent, typically, much more vulnerable, much more real, willing to encourage other people to walk in this life in such a way that those people looking at them that they have influence with don't step on the same landmines that they did. And then the third pillar and the third test of the validity, the moral validity of leadership is responsibility. How much burden is the leader really willing to bear? See, a lot of leaders, a lot of people with influence are willing to bear a burden to build their own monument, but they're not willing to get down in the dirt with people. One of the greatest examples of how to relate to people in the whole entire world is recorded in John chapter 4. And it's where Jesus makes a point of encountering an outcast woman. She was outcast for a number of reasons. One, because she's a woman, and in lots of cultures, even today, women are at best second-class citizens. There's so much pushback against the patriarchy here, and there's a lot of problems with the patriarchy, but it's not the biggest of our problems. And the Judeo-Christian mindset, belief system has done more to liberate women. In fact, we wouldn't have modern feminism in this country, the United States of America, without the Judeo-Christian ethic. It set the stage for women to be liberated. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not recognized. So anyway, back to the point of responsibility. Real leaders go where the need is, and they serve the humble. They serve the broken. In fact, Jesus says, you want to be great? Be a servant. Hey, you want to be the greatest of all? Serve the servants. Jesus went beyond that. He went to an outcast woman who was morally defamed, couldn't even go to the place where the women would have the opportunity. Women's work was never done. That was true back then, and it's probably true today. But he went to the place where the women could congregate and gossip and commune and laugh and share their heartaches and their sorrows and their joys together, which was the well. They would do that early in the morning because they're going to need water all day long for their needs. This woman had to come when no one else was there. Jesus knew that. He showed up there just to encounter her. He led her by serving her. Does your leader strike you as a servant? Oh, I've met leaders who were incredibly corrupt. In fact, one of the most impressive leaders I've ever met personally and dealt with personally over a long period of time was a psychopath. Didn't know that. And he was incredibly adept at reeling you in with little acts of kindness and thoughtfulness and attaboys and little acts of promotion. The incredible thing was he would promote you in public and tear you down in private, just to make sure you didn't, try and usurp his authority. Real leaders lead in large part by serving. So in closing this thing out, how do you stack up? Are you accountable? Do you take responsibility for fixing things, for connecting dots, for filling gaps, for healing wounds? Or you just operate and exercise your authority, maybe with a smile on your face, so that people think you have a good heart? Well, how accountable are you to people? A big part of that accountability is allowing people to see your flaws as well as your victories, the defeats as well as the victories, the times you stumbled as well as the times that you've crossed the finish line first. It's not just weak humor when I say that I don't have all the answers, but I've made all the mistakes. And some would say, well, you haven't made all the mistakes. Well, that's true in some respects. I haven't acted out every mistake, but I've pretty much made every stupid mistake that a man can make. So how do you stack up? But importantly, in your workplace, in the clubs and the groups that you're associated with, how do those who seek leadership, how do they stack up? Do they just manipulate and use people to build their own kingdom? Or do they live in such a way that by their example of service to others, real service, honesty, transparency, humility, empathy, mercy, justice, they really recommend themselves in such a way that they encourage you to be more than you are? Hey, I wish you well.